today's talk on the East-West divide, on the European migration crisis, reflections and narratives. This talk, like many at the Watson Institute, was initiated by a series of groups at Brown University, not by the Watson Institute itself, but it is exactly the kind of session that the Watson Institute promotes, where leading researchers can come and address pressing contemporary issues. Our speaker today, Jacques Rupnik, is professor of political science and history at the Institut d'études politiques, or Sciences Po, in Paris, France. He is now visiting scholar also at the Minda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies at Harvard University. Dr. Rupnik was born in Prague. He did graduate work in Paris. He has held numerous senior advisory positions, which it would take me a very long time to list, although they illustrate both the range of his experience and the authoritative perspectives which he is widely recognized as having. I think it is simplest if I simply say that Jacques Rupnik is one of the leading, if not the single leading commentator on East European, West European relations, and certainly has been since he came to Paris from Prague in the 1970s. I should say specifically, at least, that he has held research fellowships at the Russian Research Institute at Harvard University, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Among the advisory positions that he has held are the British Broadcasting Corporation's World Service, the European Commission, and perhaps especially important, the first presidential administration of Václav Havel after the Velvet Revolution in Prague. He is a widely published author on the political history of Eastern Europe, the legacies of communist rule, and the dynamics of democratic politics in Western as well as Eastern Europe, and has a special interest in the ongoing, or we may have to say as well soon here, the halting process of European integration. Dr. Rupnik will speak for 35 to 45 minutes. We'll have time for question and answer, and also for informal discussion following this session right outside. I would like to mention that his talk today is hosted among the organizations I mentioned by the Association of Central and East European Students here at Brown, who really initiated this idea, and thanks to them for doing so. The talk is also co-sponsored by the Department of Slavic Languages, Middle East Studies, the Department of Anthropology, and the Kogut Center for the Humanities. So, Jacques, it's really a terrific pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Ziegler, for this introduction. Thank you for the invitation to Brown University, to the Watson Institute, and to the very enterprising students who made it possible. I thought that one way of approaching a topic of interest, I think, both to Americans and Europeans, migrations and how to deal with them, would be to connect it to the current European debates. And then maybe in the discussion you may discover or not the extent to which these debates overlap or perhaps not. Let me begin with two quotes which may set the scene, so to speak, for this topic of Europeans divided on migration. One comes from Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1951. The first damage to the nation state caused by the arrival of hundreds of thousands of stateless people was that the right of asylum the only symbol of human rights in the sphere of international relations, was abolished. And then the quote continues, the general decomposition of political life is illustrated by nothing better than the vague hatred permeating all and everything, etc. And she describes the predicament of the migrant as sort of, for her, the emblematic figure of the 20th century, or at least the first half of the 20th century. The second quote, much more recent, is from the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, who said this at the end of last year, just as his country was taking over the presidency of the European Union. There is this system of rotating presidencies that you may be familiar, he says. He said, as we all know from the Roman Empire, big empires go down if their borders are not well protected. The EU risks suffering the same fate if it does not regain the control of its borders and stops the massive influx of refugees. So we really have an imperative that this is handled. So there you have the two poles of the discussion, you know, Hannah Arendt and sort of the migrant as the figure of the 20th century and the human rights question that it raises, and then the current predicament in Europe and in the European Union today is that that may well be true, but at the same time, look what it's doing to our politics in each of our countries and to the European Union as an institution. So there you have the big dilemma, the two poles within which the issue is approached. I, for this purpose, will focus on the way the debate about migration, the current wave of migration, has brought to the surface a divide between East and West in Europe at the very moment when we thought that divide was over. I mean, for the last 20 years, we have seen a formidable process of convergence between what used to be known as Eastern Europe or East Central Europe and Western Europe. There have been various ways of looking at it, at measuring it, but on the whole, you could consider the last quarter of a century as a formidable process of not only economic catching up, institutional integration, political reconnecting between the two halves of the continent. This is the most spectacular achievement, you can say, that Europe has, from this point of view, performed for East Central Europe, the modernizing tasks that previous empires didn't succeed in doing. I may remind you that the empires of the past sometimes had that modernizing ambition, did not succeed very well. Even after World War II, the Soviet project presented itself in Eastern Europe as a modernizing project of presumably backward reactionary societies that needed socialist type of modernization. So that was at least the motto of the day. Well, we know what happened to that modernization. And this, you know, could be called the third modernization, the European integration project. And that is a spectacular success. I didn't want to inflict on you the figures, but I do have them, where you can measure. You can take any number of criteria, but the most commonly used, the GDP per capita, and you look at, let's say, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, etc. You look at them 20 years ago, and you see that there are maybe at 30% of EU average. You look at them in 2010, and you see within 15 years that they are at 2/3 or at 70% of EU average. So this is the most, in such short time, in 10, 15, maximum 20 years, the most spectacular process of narrowing the gap. So you can say convergence in economic terms. You can measure the convergence in terms of lifestyles, life expectancy, institutional or integration, of course, into the European Union, which was part of the consolidation of democracy in that part of Europe. You know, there's a huge literature, huge academic industry in the field of European studies, and it's called, you know, transformative power, the normative power of the European Union, how the European Union extends its norms and values and institutions to the east of the continent through the process that was known as the enlargement of the European Union, and that has, so to speak, confirmed the convergence process of the last 20 years. Final word on this: who is presiding the European Council today? Who is sort of the president of Europe today? Former Polish Prime Minister, Mr. Donald Tusk. And that, in a way, is symbolizing the success story of that transition, which consolidated democracy and produced the most spectacular catching up between the two halves of the continent in modern history. Now, I emphasize, perhaps overemphasize, the success story only to introduce the but, and this is where my talks actually begin. At the very moment when we thought this part of Europe had completed that convergence and even withstood the effects of the international economic and financial crisis after 2008. Poland was the only country in Europe that didn't have a recession after 2008. And incidentally, when the countries of East Central Europe were confronted with the impact of the crisis on the European Union, and particularly the divisive effects of that crisis on the Eurozone, we have discovered then that Europe was no longer divided east-west. It was divided north-south. And how you measured that, you know, it was called the spread. Well, that's the interest rates on government bonds, basically, that you could measure very easily, the north-south divide within the very core of the European Union, the Eurozone. The Greek crisis was obviously a crucial moment in that. And in the Greek crisis and on the Eurozone issue, where did the countries of East Central Europe stand? Well, they sided with Northern Europe. I heard at Harvard, where I was then visiting in the spring of 2011, so exactly 5 years ago, I heard the Polish foreign minister, Radek Sikorski, say, in the financial crisis, in the divide that is now at the heart of the Eurozone, Poland is part of Northern Europe. So, you know, I had spent a lot of time studying that part of Europe. I wrote a book about the rediscovery of Central Europe. It was called The Other Europe. So here are countries that used to be known after the war as Eastern Europe, part of the Eastern Bloc, who in the 1980s reinvented themselves as Central Europe. You know, the big debates, Milan Kundera, Czeslaw Milosz, Georgi Konrad, all of them. Central Europe. No, we are not Eastern Europe. We are Central Europe. We are And that was a way of dissociating themselves from the Soviet Empire. It was a way of claiming not only a distinct cultural identity, but an allegiance to the West. Kundera's article was about Central Europe, the tragedy of Central Europe as a kidnapped West. Okay? That was the rediscovery of Central Europe. After 1990, they're no longer interested in being Central Europe. They want to head west. Okay, west of Europe. We are just Europe, you know, etc. Well, by the time the Greek financial crisis hits Europe, they are Northern Europe. Now, to reassure you, it's still the same countries. They have not moved. But the mental map, the mental geography has played havoc with their their self-identity, if you want, and we've had this spectacular transformation. So, just as they discovered that they were possibly, in some cases, even Northern Europe, we have, in the context of the migration crisis that we've been facing for the last couple of years, particularly last year, we have rediscovered, in a new context, an East-West divide in Europe. It has taken two forms. In the discussion, we may return to that. One is the regression, the democratic regression in some of the countries. You know, Oskar Jászai, the Hungarian author, historian, political figure in 1918, in the 1920s has had an essay about what is Hungary, which he called in German Rückschlag. It was a regression from the democratic hopes of 1918. You could say that under Orbán, Hungary has undergone something similar, a kind of regression, abandoning the principle of rule of law and separation of powers, government interference with public broadcasting, the media. And we've had more recently similar developments occurring in Poland with Kaczynski and the PiS government coming to power. Slovakia's elections, if you have followed, have not only, you know, you have left-wing nationalist populists bringing into the government right-wing nationalists from the Slovak national parties. Latest developments in Croatia go in a similar direction. I don't want to dwell on that, but simply that is the first thing. The regression of democracy and the fact that after joining the European Union, this is not the end of history. This is not sort of democracy established once and for all. You can have setbacks, and that is one way in which the countries of East Central Europe have acquired a distinct profile with nationalist, conservative parties that, as Orbán himself says, are adepts of illiberal democracy. He himself says, well, you criticize me for constraining the role of the Constitutional Court, and the Poles have now done the same thing, but that's because you are adepts of liberal democracy. What I'm adept, that is your point of view, but there are different concepts of democracy. I am proponent of illiberal democracy. And illiberal democracy is the sovereign people, the sovereignty of people. If you have the majority, if you have the two-thirds majority in parliament, you can abolish any decision that had been already approved by the Constitutional Court. So it is as simple as that. It is, you know, the volonté générale of Rousseau versus the separation of power according to Montesquieu. And clearly, Orbán and Kaczynski and others think, well, you know, liberal democracy is just... Why is this important? Because the European Union, the whole European project, is based on the rule of law. That is the separation of power. And that is the idea that we all share, not only a single market, but certain legal norms 100,000 pages of legal norms, and that if there is a problem, we have independent judiciary to arbitrate these cases. You know, the whole thing functions simply because these common norms are accepted and observed. If somebody says, well, you know, I have a different view and I opt out and I don't think that independent judiciary is essential, but you have a problem. So this is one way in which East Central Europe returned to the fore. And then there is a second way in the context of the refugee crisis. Again, I suppose you have followed more or less their posture or their declarations on the subject. The idea was a firm refusal of the European Union decision to spread refugees arriving into Europe according to quotas. That was a proposition of the European Commission, that the refugees are coming in, and a number at that time, this was at the beginning of the fall, the European, in September, I think the European Commission proposed something like 160,000 that would be spread in different countries, France 34,000, this country so many, and East Europeans, according to the size of their population, were getting a sense of. The Visegrad group met and they refused it. So one thing, refusal of taking part in this model. And the second aspect was the rhetoric that went with it. The rhetoric that went with it, in the case of Orban in particular, is we are building a fence here. You might have seen the fence that was built on the Hungarian-Serbian border. We're building a fence because we are actually protecting Europe from an invasion from the Arab world, from the Arab-Muslim invasion of Europe. We've been through that in history, is the subtext. You know, this was the Turkish invasions, you know, the crucial date in Hungarian history, you know, 1524, the Battle of Mohács and the defeat by the Turks. And this is when Budapest was no longer the capital of Hungary. It was moved to a place then called Pozsony, and that is today known as Bratislava. And for a century and a half, that was the capital of Hungary. Turkish troops stopped in 1683 by Prince Sobieski's troops on the doors of Vienna, etc. So you have that kind of subtext. We are protecting the boundaries of Europe against an invasion, and we are protecting a European civilization, European culture, identity, and European civilization. The Slovak Prime Minister, Mr. Fico, had a nice phrase on this. He said, we can't take any Muslim migrants here because we don't have any mosques here. I mean, they would be unhappy here. Let them go to Germany or France. There are plenty of mosques there. So that was the thing. Kaczynski, the leader of the Polish ruling party, even suggested that spreads of epidemics could be associated with the arrival of migrants. So you have a picture that is not only opposing the European decision, but that introduces a rhetoric which is interesting. I'm leaving aside the nasty part of it, and there's a lot of nastiness in it, but I'm simply interested in the rhetoric about Europe. We are defending Europe against an invasion. We are protecting European civilization. And why does this ring a bell? Because this idea that Europe is not just a common market, but that it is a civilization to be defended, that's an idea that was brought about in the 1980s by the leading writers of Central Europe. I already mentioned Milan Kundera in his famous article, Czesław Miłosz, György Konrad in Budapest, a whole range of Central European. In the 1980s, they've rediscovered Central Europe, But there was the idea that this is a civilization that belongs, as Kundera said, culturally Western, politically under the domination of the East, geographically in the center. That was the tragedy of Central Europe, if you will. But they had this idea that they defend European civilization vis-à-vis the totalitarian threat from the East. The Russian Russia, which was considered in Kundera's word as another civilization. Czeslaw Milosz, the same thing in his book, Another Europe. Russia is another civilization, okay? So you have the return of a discourse on European civilization in a completely new guise by people who do not have, of course, neither the literary ability nor the same kind of approach to what that civilization could mean. You have a distorted version of that discourse reintroduced in the context of the migrant crisis. The big difference in the 1980s, if you want, is that the kind of civilization that they were talking about, Milosz, Kundera, and many others, had to do with a civilization often linked to the Austrian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that was a pluralist, if you want, multicultural, to use a contemporary term. That was not the term they were using then. But it was a pluralist culture where, you know, Czechs, Germans, Jews, etc., coexisted in the same area. When Czeslaw Milosz was talking about his hometown where he was born, Wilno, well, he described what Wilno was before the war. It was Polish, large Jewish population, Russian, etc. And he goes through the enumeration of all the population that lived there. And then he said at the end, oh, and some Lithuanians too. You know, now it's the capital of Lithuania, so I hope there's no Lithuanians. I haven't offended anybody, but okay, this is how you go from multiculturalism to new national identities in Eastern Europe. So not only the Central Europe they were slightly nostalgically reclaiming was a different one from the one that Orban, Fico, Kaczynski, and others are talking about. But what I would call the Kundera moment of the 1980s coincided in parallel with the Havel moment, rediscovery of human rights, civil society, democratic values, opening to Europe. It was a freedom and openness. That was a gist of what was there. So you would have the Kundera moment, European civilization, combined with the Havel moment, democracy and human rights. What you have now with Orban, Kaczynski et compagnie, you have protection of of nationhood first, protection, national identity, and European civilization, but without the other part, without the Havel moment, which has been eclipsed. So we are and this happens in a context where to the west of the countries I'm talking about, particularly in Germany, the whole acceptance of migrants is accompanied with a discourse on European values too. And what are European values according to Chancellor Merkel? Universal human rights. So on one hand, you have defense of European civilization, and there you have, no, what is European values? Universal human rights. The complete universalist abstraction. The German political philosopher Ulrich Beck says, substantial void and radical openness. That's what Europe for him stands for, substantial void and radical openness. You know, so there we have the two extremes. These guys who define civilization in very substantive terms. And there you have, what is Europe? No, norms and procedures. Substantial void. These are the two opposite poles in the debate. In between, of course, that's where the real debate about migration is. This is where the rest of Europe, in France and as well, is situated. Even countries that have accepted the migration, including the quotas, of course, have situated themselves between these two opposite poles, sharing neither. My question is, why is it that the countries of East Central Europe have, in this context, resurfaced in such guise? In telegraphic style, because time is running out, I will suggest a few hypotheses, a few explanations of this. One of them is that these countries were indeed multicultural, to use this inappropriate term for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or for that matter, for the Ottoman Empire. They used to be multicultural, but then gradually, in the 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century, they, with the combined efforts of Hitler and Stalin, became homogeneous nation states. Hitler exterminated the Jews. Stalin helped to expel the Germans. Poland, for the first time in its history since World War II, has become a homogeneous nation state. Czech Republic today is a homogeneous nation state, even separated from the Slovaks, with whom they shared a common state since 1918, you know. Alone at last, you could say. Hungary, Slovenia. These are homogeneous nations. That's the first thing. Secondly, in the post-war period, they were closed behind the Iron Curtain. Not only couldn't they go out, but there couldn't be anybody coming in. You wouldn't have migrants coming in from anywhere because of the Iron Curtain. While they were closed in behind the Iron Curtain, in the west of Europe, over the last, since the late 60s, let's say, successive waves of migrants from Africa, often from former colonies, were coming to Western Europe. Each country has its own connection. For the British, India and Pakistan. For the French, it's North Africa, let's say. For Germans, Turkish migrants. Belgium have their own. Dutch have their own, all the way to Indonesia. It's different varieties. Over 40, 45 years, nearly half a century, you have basically a steady arrival of migrant populations who have settled. Initially, they were thought Gastarbeiters. Gast means guest, means he's probably going back. He's not going back. He's there to stay. And as I stated, gradually, our societies, in very different ways, each of our countries in Western Europe has done it in a different ways, have become de facto multicultural. And again, I have problems with the terms, but because it's loaded and it's very debated, but you know more or less what I mean, and it refers to migrant population that have settled in, and that have, of course, in recent years, become often a problem in the suburbs of our cities. Molenbeek is now the most famous among them. So we have the two situations. If you go today to Warsaw, to Bratislava, to Ljubljana, etc., you are in a different Europe from that of London, Amsterdam, Paris, which is much more like New York, if you see what I mean. This is, in that way, the other Europe, that was the title of book then is still other in terms of its composition. And in terms of the mental pictures, very other, very, very much so. So this is the secondary. Now, what is the irony in the whole thing is that their concept, East Central European concept of nationhood, has developed on the German model, not on the French model where the state builds the nation and it's a nation of citizens. No, the German model is Kulturnation. You define nation by language, cultural identity, sometimes religious component to it, etc. Okay, that was the 19th century. You take the German model of the nation to oppose the Germans. It's a great classic. Okay. They have transposed this concept of the cultural nation to the European level. Okay, so they have transposed on a European level. What is Europe? Well, it's a cultural identity, civilization that we have to protect, just as we were protecting the national identity way back from Germanization in the 19th century. So this happens at the very moment when the Germans, who had invented the concept and who had practiced it until fairly recently, I remind you that they've changed their citizenship law only slightly more than 10 years ago, about 12 years ago or so. It was Schröder, Fischer, Joschka Fischer, okay, green social. They abolished it and they introduced citizens concept. Until then, German stood by the ethnic definition of the nation. If you were coming from Kazakhstan, you didn't speak a word of German, but you could argue with your name that 2 centuries ago or whatever, your family had some German ancestry. You were immediately German citizen. If you were proving that you were a Saxon from Transylvania, coming from Romania, you immediately acquired German citizenship. Okay, so it was purely based on ethnicity. It had nothing to do with being German, even speaking German. So this is that has changed. So Germany has not only changed its citizenship law, but it has changed the way it thinks about not only nationhood but also Europe. Hence, Merkel's thing. What is Europe? Universal civil rights. So the Central Europeans transpose to the European level their concept of Kulturnation, while the Germans who invented it go universal. So we have a great irony of history and a big divide, because it's very difficult to communicate between these two concepts, very, very opposing. It's very hard to. Now, as I said, the rest of Europe tries to negotiate this difficult period and the issues associated with it in between somewhere, mainly focusing on number of issues that are associated with the arrival of masses of migrants. When I say masses of migrants, I read sometime, latest is a Brookings paper with that title, but there's now several books, articles, with the title Fortress Europe. Now, Fortress Europe, for the last 25 years, has taken in every year, 1.5 million migrant. I'm not saying asylum seekers, migrants in general, 1.5 million every year for the last 25 years. More than US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, traditional immigrant country put together. Some fortress. So on top of that, separately from that, we have this exceptional migration wave, and with a debate about asylum seekers and migrants. I mean, it turns out that until the summer of last year, the migrants that were arriving in Hungary, over 40% of them were from the Balkans. They were not from Syria. and many of them were other. So there is this debate first about distinguishing migrants and asylum seekers. This is not because, and some people say, oh, you shouldn't introduce this distinction. You must introduce it, not because there's equal dignity of human beings, no doubt about it, and one can fully respect the motives of those who come for economic reasons, of course. You know, if somebody arrives, I don't know, from Japan to Vancouver, or from Africa to Spain or to France, or whatever, for economic reasons, perfectly respectable motive. They're looking for a better life, and both for an economic migrant and for asylum seeker is a lack of hope in his country that is a prime motive. So just to make, I stress this just to make clear, I'm not introduced, but you have to have the distinction, because for the asylum seekers, it is a right of asylum. When I read the quotation from Hannah Arendt, she's talking about asylum, human rights. You are rescuing somebody who is in danger and who is asking your help. And you have the moral and legal obligation to give him that. That is the Geneva Convention of 1951, and all European Union member states have subscribed to that, and they have the duty to fulfill that. If somebody is drowning, you give him the hand to rescue him. That is the elementary thing. However, and this is where the snag is, you have the moral and perhaps legal obligation to rescue him. You may have also the moral and, if not political obligation, to tell him who we are and in what kind of society he is coming. And between the closure of the East Central Europeans, a la Orban, who just think in terms of fences and keeping them away, and if you want a mosque, that way, to Germany or to France, and the Merkel posture, human rights, substantial void, radical openness, you have the possibility to say, well, this is what you are coming here, well, this is what we are. We are countries that separate religion and politics. This is not an obvious proposition for where you come from, but that's what we are. That's what Europe is built on. We recognize the equality of men and women. That is absolutely fundamental here, not an obvious proposition where you come from. Here, we have a freedom of speech, sometimes even of caricature. You may not like that, but if there is a dispute, we settle that in court, not by violent means, etc. Anti-Semitism. Since Auschwitz, repudiation of anti-Semitism is part of European identity. Where you come from, that is not an obvious proposition. And that's an understatement. And I could go on. I could give, the 10 commandments of what is it. What I'm saying is that the migration wave forces Europeans to an exercise in self-definition. If we want to have a chance, not just to welcome refugees, humanitarian assistance, you give them food and shelter, but if you want to have a chance to integrate refugees, integrate in our societies, back to multiculturalism, you have to say who you are and under what terms, under what condition that may be possible. If you don't do that, well, then you're looking for trouble. Then you end up with Molenbeek. And a French government minister, a socialist government minister, who says, in France we have 100 Molenbeeks. Well, that's not terribly reassuring thought. So this is where we are at in the debate. Yes, we thought we had overcome the East-West divide. It has resurfaced in a particular context. We have discovered in both the economic crisis, but also now with the migrant crisis, a Europe divided east-west, north-south, and that is, of course, putting terrible strain on the European institutions, how to find a common denominator, and on the European project itself. You know, the North-South crisis, the Euro crisis, it was about solidarity also. How much is it economic rules? How much should it be a transfer union? That's a big question mark. You have to discuss that. There's no simple norm that the European Bank will say. And similarly about migrants. How many you can take, under what condition? Chancellor Merkel decided unilaterally on September 4th to take in the refugees. It was a very noble decision. And, you know, you make the cover of Time magazine and you are the Woman of the Year, and, you know, maybe people will propose her for Nobel Prize or what have you. That may be the case. But you also unleash within Europe a political dynamics that you do not control. When she says, wir schaffen das, well, maybe not. You know, we don't know. It's an uphill struggle. And final word, for 20 years or so, we thought that the European project worked by gradual extension, not just of its economy, but of its norms, its institutions, its values, from the center to its peripheries. This was a success story of the enlargement, but this was also underlying the policies of so-called neighborhood policy to the east and to the south. What we discover now, that it is no longer the center that is shaping the periphery, but that both peripheries have imploded simultaneously, with Ukraine and Putin stepping in the east, and with the unraveling of the southern Mediterranean shore in the aftermath of the Iraq War and the Arab Spring, and basically with ISIS stepping in and producing an unprecedented migration wave. Suddenly, we discover that our politics, not just the European agenda as it is set, they have to deal with it, but the politics, internal politics in each of our countries, with the rise of nationalist, populist, anti-immigrant and anti-European parties, playing havoc, as I said, with the very idea of the European project. Suddenly we discover, we thought we were shaping the periphery. Now it's the periphery reshaping the political agenda in Europe itself. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this broad overview. You've raised many issues. I'm sure there are lots of questions. I know I have a couple, but let me see who else would like to follow up with you. Tony Levitos.
Thank you, Professor Ruffman. I deeply appreciate the erudition and the breadth of overview of a wide variety of issues. But I'm a little nervous about what seems to be the fundamental claim, which is that the new division in Europe, or that the migration crisis has precipitated a new division in Europe. And it makes me a little uneasy for two reasons. One, I think that it's pretty clear empirically that the move towards illiberalism in Eastern Europe preceded the migration crisis. I'll agree that the migration crisis has added fuel to it. But I don't think you need the migration crisis to explain Kaczynski or Orban, to say nothing of Gruevski or others. It may help them. I think they've used it strategically. But that split, or that tendency, was there before the migration crisis added fuel to the fire. on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm not so sure that the European debate's response to the migration crisis has been that different. If you went country by country in terms of saying no to the quotas and no more, we're closing down the borders, we're breaking the rules of Schengen. So I'm not sure that the Western European response has been that different. Which raises for me the more profound question, which goes back to the beginning of your talk, which is, yes, the convergence of the last 25 years within the European Union, between East and West, has been a remarkable success at one level. But if it's not the migration crisis that's really producing the backlash, only accelerating, what is the meta picture of behind the narrative of that collapse? It's a big question and maybe an unfair one, but I don't think it's your story that it's migration that's driving this seems to me to be temporally in a stretch at a minimum.
Well, first of all, I did not say that migration was the cause. The illiberal moment of Orban precedes the migration crisis. I didn't say. I said there were two ways in which Central Europe has returned. One was the illiberal moment, and then on top of that, or extending that if you want, or giving it a new ideological content and profile, was the migration crisis, and where nationalism acquires a new European dimension that it didn't have before. So yes, the illiberal moment precedes it, but the migration crisis only accelerates it. A Polish sociologist, Aleksander Smolar, recently said that, Kaczynski would have won the election, he would not have gotten the majority, the full majority in parliament without the migration wave. That was his statement. Okay, this is difficult to prove, but he definitely has thrived, the nationalist moment, all over the nationalist identity politics have thrived. Orban, last spring, at this time last year, Orban was going down in ratings. Since the summer, he's gone up. He's back to 75 or whatever, etc. So yeah, they've been able to use it. They haven't created it. They've used it. So I didn't say that it has precipitated the illiberal moment. It has revealed the division. It has not precipitated. It has revealed it. It gave it a new dimension, new profile. These are the two faces, the illiberal moment and the anti-immigrant moment. They mutually reinforce each other. It is the illiberal nationalist conservative parties that thrive on this anti-immigrant and anti-European discourse, because behind it there is sovereignist rhetoric and anti-European rhetoric. When you say that it's not very different from responses in Western Europe, well, that I beg to differ. This is very different from the responses you have in Western Europe. Governments in Western Europe have, each of them reacted differently. None has endorsed the rhetoric that I have referred to. All of them, have accepted the quota policies proposed by the European Commission. It is, they might have reservations, that they all accept it. It is the Visegrad Group meeting in Prague that has refused explicitly the quotas, and they still do, as they recently reinstated. So there I would beg to differ. What has happened, of course, in the meantime, is that between last summer and the humanitarian moment and today, you had a number of things. First of all, the scale of it. And secondly, you had Cologne and you had a number of other things, which suddenly has brought, in each of the countries, including in Germany, actually, you have now parties like the Alternative for Deutschland. You had Pegida in East Germany. Pegida actually fits the East European pattern, so there is a post-communist element there that plays a part, probably. And yes, all of Europe now has these parties, these movements, these political forces that basically say, who's responsible for this migration? Well, Europe, because who abolished the borders? It's the European Union. And when Merkel said, we abandon Schengen, basically, I mean, first the Greeks said it, we cannot handle it, but then Merkel explicitly said, bring them in. And second thing she said, there is no limit. Bring them in, end of Schengen. So that is a dangerous moment, because if you are in a European Union when you've abolished internal borders between nation states, but you've done it on the assumption that you have an external border, okay, that's called Schengen. If you then tell them, well, we don't have an external border, then, as you say in French, you create a boulevard for the nationalists, the populists, the anti-Europeans, because they say, we told you so. We told you so. This European project is just a tool to dismantle borders and to make your countries that are vulnerable, etc., to this. So we now have an uphill struggle unless you fix very quickly the question of borders. There is no such thing as a political entity without borders. European Union is a political entity. It's a political, it may not please you, you may not like borders. European Union is a political entity. There is no, quote me one, that if you've taken somebody in, it's because you've left somebody out. That's tautology. It's a definition of what European Union is. So unless you persuade Europeans that they have external borders, the whole project will unravel and will go back. People will, the pressure to bring back national borders, which is already happening. Look what's happening between Austria and Italy. Look what's happening between various countries. You have small warning signals. Borders is crucial. Secondly, security. You cannot completely ignore what has happened in Paris and in Brussels. This is a context in which we are talking. It just so happens that in the 13th of November in Paris, two of the guys were coming on the migrant route from Syria. And as we have now learned, the whole plot was masterminded, directed in by the ISIS headquarters. So what we have is an interplay between what I called the suburbs. In my previous book, I call it les banlieues de l'Europe. Basically bad neighborhoods of Europe that are imploding now, with the bad neighborhoods, I'm using a term of a famous article by Myron Weiner 20 years ago about migrants, actually, and a very, very fascinating and very remarkable article, directly connecting, yes, the suburbs of Europe and the suburbs of our cities. And the fact that between 10 and 15,000 Europeans, estimates vary, are fighting for the jihad, that about 400,000 to 600,000 of them have returned to Europe, with European passports, of course, is a problem. Yeah, this is the context in which we are talking about this. So borders, security question, the question of integration, not just humanitarian assistance, integration, under what terms? This is serious political debate that Europeans have, but that is a debate that democratic, liberal West Europeans are having today, if they want, if they don't want to leave the monopoly of the discussion on these issues to the nationalists, anti-immigrant Europhobes. And there are plenty of those. In each country, we have a variety of those. The big difference between East and West, in the East, they are in power. In the West, they are still in opposition.
Very short follow-up, and then we have quite a long list, so we'll take Tony's follow-up, and then if people can identify themselves, and
One
we'll
of the
try to take a
interesting-
number of questions.
Yeah, I mean, again, to go back, how different is the reaction? On this border issue is a good point, because the reaction of the European Union has not been really to strengthen the border of Europe. The amount of money that goes to Frontex, the amount of people
Very
staff,
little.
nothing. So the reaction has been to strengthen national borders within the European Union. So again, it's a difference of degree and kind, I'm just, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think we are.
Yes, Michael, could you say who you are, and we'll establish the precedent of questioners saying their name.
Michael Kennedy, I've been reading your work for 35 years. Professor Rupnik, thank you very much for this talk. Can I just flip the question a little bit and to say that we can think about the European Union as always having these different kind of regional identities, but we also have embedded in this European Union two different cultural styles that I think are transformed by this crisis. On the one hand, you have a kind of European Union that's very proceduralist, that's very probabilistic in thinking. You can almost say that it is social scientific in the way it approaches governance. On the other hand, you have a kind of categorical thinking within the European Union, which is about Europe versus not, Poles versus Germans, patriots versus cosmopolitan, or whatever it is. And I wonder, to what extent is the crisis not only producing more nationalists and populists, but even producing more kinds of analysis that relies on categorical thinking rather than more proceduralist thinking? And I would propose in this following sense, that when we say there's a division between East and West, and we make that division based on who's in power, this is not necessarily a long enduring question, right? In the sense that what will happen in France? What will happen after the Brexit debate? What would have happened had we had a better government in Poland? And what would have happened in Hungary? For example, there's a huge opposition to Orban, but they can't mobilize effectively. Why? Because most liberal Democrats don't know how to engage the labor movement or the laboring classes who are so alienated from the transition that has been created. Not unlike what is happening in the United States with the rise of Trump and the rise of Sanders. So my point in mentioning all of these things is there a different way of posing the issue? Rather than saying the East Europeans are less European, the West Europeans are more democratic. I know that's not what you're saying.
That's not what I said.
Absolutely not, because I know you're on the right side of things. On the other hand, is there a way of reframing the question so that it's not a matter of only, again, thinking about Europeans versus not, securing the borders, and rather thinking about, for example, the problem in Syria itself, and the ways in which actors, it's not in Europe, but it's a source of the crisis that we're talking about. And when Europe goes to Turkey to say, please take these refugees back, and makes a deal that is conditional on all these things we all know, all of these things I'm suggesting is a way of escaping the categorical problem of in Europe, out of Europe, East versus West, and rather thinking about the chains of consequence that are being generated that categorical thinking prohibit us from seeing.
Well, yes, indeed, there is a distinction between the European Union, which is essentially based on a common market and shared legal framework, the European acquis communautaire, 100,000 pages of legal norms. And this is often what has been criticized by people who say, well, it's Europe united by a market and by law, but the democratic substance remain on the national in the national context. So that is a sort of the congenital weakness of the European institutions, and there have been attempts over the last, I don't know, ever since the European Parliament came into effect, an attempt to give a democratic dimension, democratic legitimacy, and the European Parliament actually has become, a vector for potentially a European political democratic process. When you are voting today in European Parliament elections, you are voting for the President of the European Commission. You know that if it's a Social Democrat, you will have Mr. Schulz. You know that if you're voting for the right, you will end up with Mr. Juncker. It's a long way to go, but there is an attempt. But that fundamental problem that was there from the beginning, and the democratic dimension of the Europeanization of democracy, that is a very difficult proposition. You would have to move towards a kind of federalist model, if you want, if you are consistent with that logic. And in some ways, the euro as a common currency requires that, if it is to survive. How do you introduce a federalist moment when our politics are going the other way? So here we have something that is both necessary and impossible. Which is a definition of tragedy. So we are not quite there, but this is a very serious contradiction. One thing is, you can say, for euro to survive, you would need convergent economic policies. You would need a shared budgetary policy. You would need a convergent taxation system. You would need a number of things that would hold it together. Well, all this is possible only if you have a common polity, if you have a real democratic Europe. No taxation without representation. In this country, you invented this. So this is what you would have to do. But that democratic leap forward is very difficult to do. Václav Havel, with whom I have worked, he had, way back in the late 90s, he had suggestions about how to deal with that. He said, for instance, you could create a second chamber of the European Parliament where you would have representatives from the national parliament. So you would have people, who would be elected in the national parliament, but who would be sitting also in the second chamber. So you would have then a direct connection between the national parliament and the European Parliament, between national elected representatives and the European Parliament. So the problem is there. It has been well described in many ways, but yes, we have remained too much in the normative dimension of the European. Europe as a normative power. When you read all the literature about the European Union, going back to Ian Manners, it's normative power, diffusing norms, institutional transfers, a functionalist extension, all this language. So on one hand, you have the technocratic language of the European Union, and then you have the academic language. It's a huge academic industry that has developed over the last 15, 20 years, associated with the enlargement, associated with all the things I'm talking about. And of course, they've extended that literature or these categories to the neighborhood policy. So what was a neighborhood policy? You read the papers, the articles, neighborhood policy. It's the same literature. Normative extension, institutional transfer, etc., etc. And then comes Putin, Ukraine, then come ISIS, etc., and both neighborhoods implode at the same time, and you are left home and dry. So there are academic bubbles that sometimes explode, just like financial bubbles, and that's just too bad for those who have invested so much in those bubbles. I have not been there, partly because I've been trained as a historian, and that's a useful, sobering thing when you approach these subjects, including the neighborhoods. You want to talk about neighborhoods? We're talking about post-imperial neighborhoods. post-Soviet in the east, post-Ottoman in the south. What is the first thing ISIS said? We abolish Sykes-Picot. There's no guys writing about normative power who knows what Sykes-Picot is and where it comes from, what it is for, what are the boundaries of Iraq, etc. So yes, we have the problem with the EU and the problem with the literature on the EU. That's certainly a thing. And it is because it is so detached from the realities that there is a lot of space for identity politics for the nationalists who say, you want to talk about democracy? There is no democracy except the nation state. Sovereignty, democracy, this is historically how it has developed together within the nation state, and you have not found the formula to go beyond. And then, of course, when there is something like the migration wave, questions of borders, etc., you have debates about what kind of multiculturalism you have in mind in liberal societies. And, well, you just have to accept that in most of our societies, we probably have not found adequate answers. Each of our country has different version of it. You know, the British model, the French model. This was long discussed. You know, would the French Republican model be, you know, more resilient than the British or the Dutch, etc.? Now we're all in it together. None of them has worked successfully. But what I want to say, I would still maintain, is a big difference with what, and I tried to explain why in my talk, with Eastern Europe, who doesn't have the problem. There are no migrants there. I've been on debate on Czech television with a guy who was telling me, you know, and then the Muslims are coming, etc., and the dangers and what it means, etc. But I said, but calm down. You know, you have 5,000 Muslims in the Czech Republic. It's a country of 10.5 million. I live in a country where there are 5 million. You have to relativize your fear. So just as in Poland you had anti-Semitism without Jews, now you have anti-Islamic thing without Muslims. There are no Muslims in Slovakia. And of course, they're making sure that they will not come. So, you know, obviously, I mean, if you're bragging about it the way they do, this is it. So in this sense, yes, there are. Not only historically, I tried to explain the homogenization of nation states. I will not go back to what I said. Yeah, there are different, the societies are different. Their experiences of the other are different. And that doesn't mean it cannot be overcome in the long run, it cannot change, and that their integration in the European Union cannot help in that process. Yes. What happens, you said, what happens to, what would have happened in Poland if it had a better government, that Orbán wouldn't come? But Poland had a very successful government. As I said, it was the only country that did not have a recession, economic recession. It was a country that on all the other parameters was doing fine. And if you want my answer why this has happened and why the opposition, even in Hungary, is weak and elsewhere, is because the post-89 cycle, the liberal cycle of post-89 has been exhausted. I wrote that for the 20th anniversary. For the 20th anniversary, I was with Václav Havel. We were giving several talks from town to town. We were like, he said, we were like a circus. We were going from town to town and having the same debate, basically, for the 20th anniversary. And I wrote it, there was, I think, a piece in Journal of Democracy about the cycle being exhausted. What was 1989? You wanted democracy, you wanted to come out of the state socialist economy to join the European market, and you wanted to be part of the European Union. Return to Europe was the slogan, okay? The mission accomplished. You have democracy, guess what? It's in crisis. You wanted to be in the market? Well, financial crisis came from Wall Street and hit Europe, Eurozone, and Europe is still recovering, has not yet recovered. It's still having zero growth. We are suffering very hard, unemployment very hard. Eastern Europe perhaps less than the rest of the country. And thirdly, wanted to join Europe. You're in Europe, welcome. But we are in crisis. So all the 1989 program has been successfully accomplished. The irony of history, all its fundamental features are in crisis. The liberal cycle has been exhausted, and what comes instead
That's what we should,
is people who is with a collective project. This is my last sentence. Why the Polish government has failed? They had nothing to offer. What Tusk had to offer? Enrichissez-vous. You know, this is Guizot. This is 19th century. It's individual plan. Get rich. That's all we have to offer to you. Then come guys with a collective project. We are one nation. We are a civilization. We are Christians. We are the Polish Church. And you have a collective project. It might be a project that is not my cup of tea, but they had a collective project in the era of void. All the others had is, on one hand, just the market and get rich, or, on the other hand, Merkel's thing about universal human rights and substantial void and radical openness. Well, if with that you're trying to match identity politics and the idea of a collective project brought by Kaczynski, Orban, and a few others, you have an uphill struggle.
we should try to take a few other questions, and in fact.
Sorry, I was
think
too long, and I
we
promised
should-
to be
We should
short.
group
But
our
that's because the
questions.
question was so.
I think you're next. If you can ask your question, and Jacques, you'll have to try to remember these questions or we'll run out of time, because we've got 3 or 4. Go ahead.
So I would like to hear you comment on the role of the Balkan countries, non-European members, in the whole migrant crisis, and their even further shift right over the last few years, especially knowing that their largest supporters in the European Union, which all of them hope to join, are the Eastern European countries, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic.
Good, thanks. And our next question?
I think so much of what I wanted to say has been covered by the people. Maybe I should just skip me.
Okay.
For sake of
Thank you very
time.
much. And let's see, you also had a question, is that right?
Yeah, just wanted to find out something. I'm glad you actually mentioned the federal project and federal idea, because Europe is not a federal union yet, actually. So, in talking about Schengen as a project to rebuild a new border, so to abolish the internal borders and rebuild a new border, it's a bit wrong in my opinion, because it's not, we are not talking about a border. Schengen didn't actually work with that project. The project was a free circulation, not only of goods, economic goods, but of people. That was the project. And the second thing I wanted to point out is the fact that the problem with migrants is not just the fact that they are threatening us, that there are a lot of voices who are basically saying that that's a threat. But the problem is that they are still coming inside. So it's not a real problem of borders, but for internal security as such. But it's a problem of avoid a lot of deaths in the Mediterranean Sea. So it's
Okay.
not just our problem, it's their problem as well.
Yeah, well, on the first question, briefly, the Balkans, they are a transit and they are in transition. They are a transit for the migrants coming from the Middle East via Turkey and Greece, and they arrive in the Balkans. And it is interesting, I spoke about the Central European narrative about protection of European national identity and European civilization. The Balkans, particularly the Serbs, have tried to reinvent themselves recreate a narrative during the migrant crisis. You know, in the 1990s, with Milosevic, Šešelj, and a few others, they basically stood for ethnic cleansing. What? And Vučić, of course, the current prime minister. Yeah, it's good to remind him of his origins, political origins. So Serbia was ethnic cleansing, war, intolerance, basically what Europeans tried to oppose, right? This is why eventually you had an intervention in Bosnia, etc. Now, with the migrant crisis, it was, we are in Macedonia, we are welcoming, they're coming here, we are going to, and look at this, these Central Europeans who are lecturing us about how successful Democrats they were, they are now the ones who are ethnically closed and intolerant and God knows what, building fences. We are you know, open hearts and sharing our bread with the refugees. So this was, you know, basically the Balkans, the Serbs in particular, inventing themselves. Well, I was going to say that this all only lasted about 6 months because the idea was move on. The idea was move on, and when they stopped moving on, you began to have a problem. The second thing is, of course, you mentioned the European question. Yes, the Central Europeans, the Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, etc., they are supporters of the Balkans in the EU. That is true. Not very vocal and not often very much heard. The Balkan EU pool started 2 years ago with a conference in Berlin that Merkel organized, was followed last year in Vienna, and this year, at the beginning of July, it will be in Paris. So the Poles, the Czechs, etc., they will be welcome, but basically that process, which is crucially important that it goes on, because there is a lot of unfinished business in the Balkans. You know, I mentioned the East, Ukraine blowing up, and the South. But in between, there is the Southeast, convalescent and recovering, on the whole, moving in the right direction. The agreement between Serbia and Kosovo would never have happened without the European engagement. Europe is paradoxically propelled in the Balkans in the role of assisting in nation-state building, while it is an institution that is supposed to relativize nation-states. This is a great paradox. It is suddenly engaged against its better judgment in assisting the creation, including Kosovo, of new states. So this is a new role, providing a common roof for nation-state building after the demise of those roofs left by history. The empires of the past, Yugoslavia was a common roof of sorts, and now the European Union has to step into that role as a substitute for an empire. So that is in the Balkans. On Schengen, well, I'm not sure we have the same understanding of Schengen. Schengen is freedom of movement of people in the Union. It's not people who are citizens of the member state of Schengen, which, by the way, doesn't include all the member states of the European Union. Some of those. This is free movement. If you are a member of a Schengen country, you travel freely to another Schengen country. This is not free movement into the Schengen zone. No, that is not Schengen. Schengen is an external border with very specific conditions under which you can enter the Schengen area. So we shouldn't be. It was a crucial. Schengen is about borders. I'm sorry, this is crucial.
But your question is also about the trans-border magnetism of Europe for refugees who are dying as they try to reach Europe. Is that right? It's also a humanitarian issue in addition to the institutional? Uh-huh.
To become Erasmus or to get an
I don't
open,
know.
yeah. But the point was to face something that was happening anyways, because migrants were entering the borders anyways. So the point wasn't actually, the point could be to recognize them, where, how, but it's a flux that is going on anyways. So it's not to establish if it can be done or not. It's happening.
I suppose it's one view. Still, on Schengen, I think there's a misunderstanding. You should read what Schengen is. Schengen is a common border, and if you don't have an external border, there will be a return to national borders. That is, I absolutely stand by that. That Schengen is about protecting the external border of the European Union. Now the Europeans discover they never developed adequate means to do so. You know, Europe spends about 300 times less on protecting its external border than the United States. 300 times, you know. So, and they've now increased the budget for Frontex, for various institutions that are supposed to monitor Schengen border. This is Schengen border. If you don't have national borders, you have external borders. If you abolish the external border, you can forget about the unraveling of the European Union. This is not me. This is the Dutch Prime Minister, Dutch presidency of the European Union say, if we don't do that, unraveling follows. So this is a serious matter. One shouldn't be throwing things like that. Now, it is absolutely true that in the face of a major migration wave, you have a humanitarian emergency, and in those cases, you, especially if you are in Greece with all these islands, etc., you cannot monitor the border, so the Greeks say we cannot do it. And eventually, Merkel did that gesture, which is a, you know, daring, brave gesture, which has a number of very important and potentially grave consequences, but it is a gesture that abolished unilaterally, without consulting anybody in the EU. Anybody, nobody was consulted. Unilateral abolition of a common system of protection of borders. The response of Orban to that is, I build a fence. I'm not saying this is the right answer to that, but this is a consequence. If you tell me we have abolished Schengen, which is what Merkel did, then Orban builds this fence. I don't think this is the adequate answer. You have to find a new system of coping with refugees. I'm not saying this agreement with Turkey is a wonderful, you know, it just shows the limits of the human rights talk. Because on one hand, in the name of human rights, you bring in refugees, and then when the numbers are overwhelming, you negotiate with Erdogan, a dictatorial regime for all practical purposes, who is cracking down on the freedom of the press, who is cracking down on civil society, who is cracking down on the Turks, on the Kurds, and you negotiate with him that he keeps for longer the refugees that are already in his territories, and you promise him in exchange, again, without before consulting with other European Union members, that you reopen negotiation about Turkey's accession, and that you will give open visas for Turkish citizens to enter into the EU. Well, you know, that is German leadership stretched to the utmost in a noble fashion on September 4, in a more crude realpolitik fashion after that, and that will not be acceptable, not just to the East Europeans, but it will not be acceptable to the other Europeans either. So, you know, Thomas Mann famously said after the war, you know, we must have a European Germany so that we don't have a German Europe. Well, now we have both, and that will not be sustainable. That will not be sustainable, even under the flag of human rights. So, no, I would think that we have to do something with the countries where the refugees arrive first, the countries neighboring Syria. That's the first thing, including Turkey, of course, but not only. Secondly, we must address the causes, because Merkel only deals with the consequences, with the refugee flow. Germany is not engaged in the fight against ISIS, has not been involved in any foreign and security policy of substance of the European Union. So European Union is confronted today with the limits of its normative power, functionalist extension, all the stuff that went with the policies I have described. When normative power meets geopolitics, it has to think beyond simply humanitarian response a la Merkel. It will have to think in terms of security policy, in terms of defense policy. It concerns the European pillar of NATO. At the moment, there are only 2 countries in Europe that are capable of doing something, that is Britain and France. To some extent, a couple of others occasionally contribute. Germany is nowhere to be seen. NATO objective in military spending is minimum 2% per country. Germany, the richest country, spends 1% and has been a free rider on security for all these years. Now we discover that in our neighborhood, we have to address not just the consequences of migrant flow, we have to address the causes. And ISIS will not vanish on its own like that. It will require doing something about it. And this is what the Europeans are confronted with. Nobody will do it forever for them. Neither dealing with Putin nor with dealing with ISIS. There will be nobody always fixing it for them. They will have to stand on their own feet. And that is maybe the wake-up call that the Europeans have got through the migration crisis. I think we should end that.
We have unfortunately come to the end of our prescribed time. We do have plenty of time for informal question and answer, but I think this discussion has been both fascinating and really extremely serious in the sense that the questions have helped clarify this so far irresolvable collision between normative goals and geopolitics, a collision which is intellectual but also often very tragic in human terms. And Jacques Rupnik has given us, I think, all many, many questions to reflect upon. So please stick around for the reception. There'll be time to talk further about these issues, and we should thank Professor Rupnik for this fascinating discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.